Picture this: a mind capable of breaking codes that nations couldn't crack, a man whose work saved countless lives, shaped the future of computing, and helped end a war. But here's what you won't find in most history books: what happened to him afterward. What do you do with someone who knows too much? What happens when genius becomes inconvenient? When the very person who helped secure victory becomes a liability to the society he served? Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. Today, we're looking at a story that exists in layers. On the surface, it's documented, explained, officially resolved. But underneath, there are questions that refuse to fade, details that don't quite fit, a death that arrived too quietly, too conveniently, with too many loose ends left untied. This isn't conspiracy, it's contradiction, the kind that hides in plain sight, wrapped in official statements and archived reports that somehow leave more questions than answers. If you enjoy deep investigations into history's unresolved corners, feel free to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. As always, the visuals are here to set the atmosphere, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Now, let's begin. In 1939, as Europe descended into darkness, a small group of Britain's brightest minds gathered at a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park. Their mission was simple to state, impossible to achieve: break the German Enigma code. Among them was a mathematician named Alan Turing. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a spy in the traditional sense. He was something else entirely: a theorist, a thinker, someone who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. And he built something extraordinary, a machine that could think faster than any human team, that could sift through millions of possible combinations to find the one that mattered. It worked. Turing's work is credited with shortening the war by years. Thousands of lives saved, perhaps tens of thousands. Some estimates go even higher. His contributions to cryptography, to early computing, to the very foundations of artificial intelligence, they're difficult to overstate. But here's the first layer of strangeness. Almost no one knew about it. After the war ended, after victory parades and celebrations, after the world began to rebuild, Turing's work remained classified, not for a few years, for decades. The Official Secrets Act bound him and everyone who worked at Bletchley Park to absolute silence. He couldn't tell his family, he couldn't claim credit, he couldn't write about what he'd done, publish papers on his breakthroughs, or be recognized for contributions that changed the course of human history. He simply returned to civilian life, carrying secrets that would remain buried for 50 years. Think about that for a moment. You help win a war. You create technology that will fundamentally reshape the future. And then, you're asked to forget it ever happened, to live as though those years were ordinary, as though you were ordinary. But you're not. And the government knows it. They know exactly what you're capable of. They know what you've seen, what you've learned, how your mind works. They trusted you with their most vital secrets during wartime. But that wasn't the strangest part. The real question isn't why Turing's work was classified. In wartime, that makes sense. The question is, what happens to someone like that afterward? Someone who exists in the space between hero and liability, someone who's proven invaluable, but knows too much. Turing continued his work. He moved to the University of Manchester, researching artificial intelligence, exploring questions about whether machines could think, whether consciousness could be replicated. He was pushing boundaries, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. And he was doing it all while carrying state secrets that couldn't be revealed. In 1951, he met a man named Arnold Murray. They began a relationship. At the time, such relationships were illegal in Britain under laws dating back to the Victorian era. When a burglary at Turing's house led to police involvement, the nature of that relationship came to light. He was arrested, charged under laws criminalizing personal relationships between men, convicted Now, this is where the official narrative becomes interesting, where the documented facts start to feel like they're describing two different realities at once. What happened next raised even more questions. Here's what we know. Alan Turing was given a choice: imprisonment or a state-imposed medical treatment involving synthetic estrogen. The goal was to suppress what the government deemed criminal behavior, to alter him, to make him conform. He chose the treatment. For a year, he received regular injections. The effects were documented: physical changes, emotional shifts, the deliberate disruption of his body's natural processes. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't hidden, it was official policy, administered by medical professionals, sanctioned by the state. But let's pause here. This is the same man who helped win World War II, whose mathematical breakthroughs were considered vital to national security, whose mind was deemed so valuable that his wartime work would remain classified for half a century. And yet, when that same mind became inconvenient, when the person behind it failed to conform to societal expectations, the value disappeared, the protection vanished, the contributions, it seemed, didn't matter anymore. The story takes an unexpected turn here. Turing lost his security clearance. He was no longer allowed to work on classified projects. The government that had relied on him during its darkest hour now considered him a security risk. Not because of espionage, not because of treason, because of who he was. His passport was confiscated. His movements were monitored. He was no longer trusted to travel freely, to continue his research without supervision, to exist without surveillance. Friends later described him as resilient during this period. He continued his work on artificial intelligence, on morphogenesis, on questions that remain relevant today. Publicly, he seemed to cope. He made jokes about his situation, continued attending conferences, maintained his research. But privacy had become something he no longer possessed. And secrecy. Well, he'd lived with that for years. He'd been trained in it, bound by it, forced to carry knowledge he couldn't share. Now he was carrying something else, something more personal, more isolating. In documents from that era, you find interesting contradictions. Officials who acknowledged his wartime brilliance but expressed concern about his reliability. Reports that described him as both essential to past victories and potentially dangerous in the present. A man simultaneously celebrated in classified files and persecuted in public records. Two versions of the same person, depending on who was writing the file. What's strange isn't that laws existed. They did in many places for many years. What's strange is the selective application, the way usefulness determined treatment, the way contribution could be erased the moment it became inconvenient to remember. And perhaps strangest of all, the silence that followed. Turing couldn't speak about his war work, couldn't defend himself using the full weight of his contributions, couldn't point to what he'd done and ask whether it mattered. The very system that benefited from his genius had made sure he could never publicly claim it. To this day, no clear explanation exists for why a man of such proven value to national security was simultaneously subjected to treatment that could only compromise his well-being, his work, his ability to continue contributing. But that period ended. The treatment concluded. Turing returned to his research. Life, it seemed, continued. And then, June 7th, 1954. Alan Turing's housekeeper arrived at his home in Wilmslow, Cheshire. She found him in his bed. He had died during the night. He was 41 years old. On his nightstand, a partially eaten apple. The official determination came quickly. Cyanide poisoning, self-inflicted death. The apple was never tested, but investigators theorized it had been laced with the poison. An inquest was held 4 days later. The verdict? Death by his own hand while the balance of his mind was disturbed. Case closed. Except, here's where the official explanation begins to feel incomplete. Turing had a home laboratory. He'd been conducting experiments involving gold plating, a process that uses potassium cyanide. This was known, documented, not hidden. He'd been working with the chemical for legitimate research purposes, and those close to him later suggested he was often careless about laboratory safety. So the first question, accidental exposure. It's possible. Cyanide can be absorbed through skin, through inhalation of fumes. A man working late in a small space, tired, not following proper precautions. It happens. But that explanation was never seriously pursued. The apple. Everyone remembers the apple. It's become symbolic, wrapped up in theories about Snow White, about Turing's documented fondness for fairy tales, about poetic endings and hidden meanings. But the apple was never tested, never analyzed for cyanide, never definitively connected to his death. His mother rejected the verdict for the rest of her life. She insisted it was an accident, that her son had been in good spirits, that he was actively planning future projects. She pointed to his calendar, appointments scheduled, work in progress, no indication of someone preparing to end their life. Friends described him similarly, engaged in his research, making plans, showing no signs of the despair that supposedly overtook him that night. But that wasn't the strangest part. The inquest was brief, remarkably so. A man whose work had been central to national security, who had been under government surveillance, who possessed knowledge that remained classified, died under unclear circumstances, and the investigation concluded in days. No thorough examination of the laboratory. No testing of the apple. No serious consideration of accident or alternative explanations. Just death by his own hand. Simple. Tragic. Case closed. Now, this is where we have to be careful, because the jump from incomplete investigation to something more deliberate is easy to make and almost impossible to prove. And this isn't that kind of story. But consider the contradictions. A man who survived years of secrecy, who endured state-imposed medical treatment, who lost his security clearance and his freedom to travel, but continued working, continued contributing, continued living. And then, suddenly, he doesn't. Timing. That's another strange layer. By 1954, the Cold War was escalating. Security concerns were paramount. Turing still possessed knowledge about British cryptographic methods. He'd travelled to Norway the previous year despite his passport restrictions. He'd maintained contacts in various countries. He was, by any measure, someone who knew valuable things. And he was someone who had already been deemed unreliable by the state. What happened next raised even more questions. Files related to Turing's security status remain partially classified even now. Certain documents about his surveillance, about concerns regarding his travel, about the government's assessment of him in those final years, they're still locked away. Which means we don't have the full picture. We have the official verdict. We have the testimony of friends and family. We have the circumstantial details, the laboratory, the apple, the cyanide. But we don't have everything. Some researchers have suggested accident was more likely than self-inflicted death. Others point to his documented depression following his conviction and treatment. Some note the convenience of the timing, the speed of the inquest, the gaps in investigation. And some simply note, we'll probably never know. Because here's the final layer of strangeness, the silence. Turing's contributions remained classified until 2009. For 55 years after his death, his most important work stayed secret. The public didn't know what he'd done, didn't know why he mattered, didn't understand what had been lost. He received a royal pardon in 2013, 60 years too late. Recognition arrived long after it could matter to the person who earned it. To this day, No clear explanation exists for why the investigation into his death was so cursory, why certain files remain classified, why a man of such obvious historical importance was afforded so little scrutiny when his life ended under questionable circumstances. The official answer: death by his own hand. The persistent questions: was it really? Could it have been an accident? Why was the investigation so brief? What's in those files that still can't be released? And perhaps most importantly, why did it take so long for the truth about his contributions to emerge? Alan Turing's story exists in layers. There's the hero narrative, the genius who broke unbreakable codes, who shortened a war, who laid foundations for the modern world. There's the tragedy, a man punished for who he was, stripped of recognition, subjected to treatment that today would be considered inhumane and cruel. And then there's the ending, the one that doesn't quite fit either story, the one that leaves room for questions that persist 70 years later. What do you do with someone who knows too much? Someone whose contributions are vital but whose existence is inconvenient? Someone who helped secure victory but couldn't be publicly celebrated? You classify their work. You monitor their movements. You maintain plausible deniability about their value while ensuring their silence. And when they die under circumstances that raise questions, you close the case quickly, you file the reports, you move on. Maybe it was self-inflicted. Maybe the weight of everything, the secrets, the punishment, the isolation, became too much. Maybe it was an accident, a tired man, a careless moment, chemicals that don't forgive mistakes. Maybe it was something else, something we don't have clearance to know about, something still sitting in classified files, redacted, protected by the same systems of secrecy that defined his wartime work. The truth is, we don't know. We have pieces, fragments, official explanations that feel incomplete and alternative theories that can't be proven. We have contradictions that were never resolved and questions that were never seriously asked. What we do know is this: Alan Turing deserved better. Better recognition, better treatment, better answers. And he deserved for those answers to arrive while he was still alive to hear them. Let me know what you think in the comments. What feels unresolved to you? What explanation makes the most sense? And what other mysteries from history should Weird World Files explore next? Some stories don't end. They just stop. And the questions linger in the space where closure should have been. This was one of those stories. Thanks for watching.